I sat in that reading room for 3 hours before I opened the box. I told myself I had come to see what they had on me. That wasn't the truth. I had come to see what I had on everyone else. The first page I turned to wasn't about a colleague. It was about Alexandru, my closest friend. I wrote that he had expressed defeatist sentiments after Czechoslovakia. I recorded a joke he told me in confidence. My handwriting looked calm, administrative. He brought apples for the students from his mother's garden. He had a laugh that started in his shoulders. I knew all of that when I wrote his name down. And I did it anyway. For years I told myself it was to protect my husband. My daughters? That is a story I need to tell. My daughters are in their 60s. They don't know. But these files exist, and one day someone will find my name. They will learn about their mother from a piece of paper. They won't hear it in my voice, so I am telling you first. But I need to start earlier. I remember the smell of linden trees on Strada Horea. It was a sweet, heavy scent, especially in the evenings of early summer. It should have been a comfort, but in those years, the early 50s, it felt like a perfume laid over something else. The city itself was holding its breath. You'd walk down a street one day and the Hungarian street signs were there, faded and familiar. The next morning, they'd be gone, replaced by new Romanian ones, the paint still glossy. No announcement. Just a different reality when you woke up. I was 22, newly married to Georg. We lived in 2 rooms on Calea Mainiancitur, in one of those new blocks that smelled of damp plaster for years. The smell from the family below us was always boiled cabbage. It seeped up through the floorboards, a constant humble reminder. We were lucky to have those rooms. Georg was a civil engineer, a quiet man, precise. He drew his plans in ink so fine you needed a magnifying glass to see the detail. He had studied in Bucharest before the war. He had a cousin who left for France in 47. These were not things you talked about, but I knew them. They were part of the quiet man I loved. My world was the classroom. Coala Generala Nistar 12, 40 children to a room. The portrait of Georg Judej hung above the blackboard, watching. Every Monday morning, I submitted my lesson plans to the director, and every literature class, I had to begin with a paragraph. I had to connect Eminescu, our great national poet, to the principles of socialist construction. I would stand there, with the chalk in my hand, and find a way to make the moonlit romanticism of Luciaf cool about. Collective farming. The children's faces were blank. They were learning, very young, the art of listening without hearing. I want you to understand what we had, the texture of an ordinary happiness. It's important. Because later, I needed to remember what I was trying to protect. Sundays at the market on Piauța Uniui. The crowds, the noise, the colors of the vegetables. Once, I bought a single orange. It was a luxury. I brought it home and the girls, they were so small then, they watched my every move. Saturday evenings, the radio would play folk music. Georg would sometimes, very rarely, take a risk. He would move the wardrobe, lift a loose floorboard, and pull out a pre-war edition of Blaga's poetry. He'd read to me in a low voice, "I do not crush the world's corolla of wonders." The words felt dangerous and beautiful, like holding a match in a dark room. Georg was not a political man. He was an engineer. He believed in measurements, in tolerances, in what could be proven. That was his mistake, I think. He applied logic where it didn't belong. I remember a dinner party, 1951. Our neighbor Marin was there. The wine had been poured. Someone mentioned the collectivization in the villages. And Georg, in that quiet factual tone of his, said he thought it was historically premature. Just a technical assessment. A question of sequence. I saw Marin nod thoughtfully. I didn't know then. I didn't know that Marin had already reported him for his cousin in France. that this remark was just another line in a file that was growing. I had that happiness. The smell of Linden and damp plaster and boiled cabbage. The weight of my husband's head on my shoulder when he fell asleep reading. The sound of my daughter's breathing in the next room. I want you to understand what I had before I understood what I was willing to do to keep it. Because you cannot understand the choice if you don't understand the thing that was at stake. It wasn't grand. It was terribly, quietly small, and it was everything. The man came on a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were for grading compositions, and I was always tired. I was at my desk, red pencil in hand, when the director's secretary appeared at my classroom door. Her face was perfectly empty. She said there was a visitor for me in the director's office, a man. He was waiting. It was a Thursday in March. I remember because Thursdays were when we had our staff meeting, and I was gathering my papers when the school director, Comrade Popper, came to my classroom door. His face was the color of the chalk dust on the blackboard. He said there was a man in his office who needed to speak with me. He said I should go immediately. The director's office was on the second floor. I walked up the stairs, and with each step, I felt a kind of cold settling in my stomach. I had been expecting something like this, the way you expect a tooth to need pulling. You know it's coming. You just don't know the day. I opened the door, and there he was, sitting in Comrade Popper's chair. He wore a civilian suit, a grey one, but his shoes were military. Polyester black leather, thick-soled. I noticed the shoes first. He did not stand up. He gestured to the chair in front of the desk. He said his name was Major Drogici. On the desk between us was a manila folder. It was closed, but the tab was facing me. My name was typed on it. Elena Munteanu. Seeing it there, in that official typeface, made my breath catch. It was proof I had already been made into a document before the conversation even began. He spoke quietly, almost politely. He told me my husband, Joch, had come to their attention. He listed the reasons. The cousin in France. The remark about collectivization at that dinner party years before. A letter Georg had written in 1954 to a colleague in Timișoara, a technical letter about concrete mixtures that had been opened and read. He said they had a very complete picture. He said Georg was not being arrested today. Whether he would be arrested at all depended, he said, in some measure on my willingness to be what he called a patriotic citizen in a practical sense. Then he told me what that meant. I was to write reports, monthly, by hand on the paper he would provide. They would be about the political reliability of my colleagues and, when relevant, about the attitudes expressed by students whose parents were of interest. I was to place the sealed envelope in a specific drawer in the school secretary's office on the last Friday of each month. I would have a code name, Informatoarea Liliana. He gave me 48 hours to decide. He said I should not discuss this with anyone, not even my husband. He said the consequences of discussion would be unambiguous. Then he stood, nodded, and left me alone in the director's office with the empty chair and the ghost of my name on the desk. I taught my afternoon classes. I don't remember a single word I said. The bell rang, and I walked out of the school, but instead of going straight home, I turned toward the river. I needed the air. I needed to move. I walked along the Sampai. The water was grey and fast with the spring melt. I watched it, and I understood with a terrible clarity that I had already decided. I had decided the moment I saw the folder. The 48 hours were a formality, a courtesy to allow me to arrange my own conscience into an acceptable shape. So I began that arrangement. I told myself I would write nothing that was not already known. I told myself I would be vague, that I would protect everyone. I told myself this was the price for Georg's safety, for our daughter's future, for the ordinary life of boiled cabbage and lesson plans that was all we had. I told myself many things on that walk home. The river didn't argue with me. It just flowed, cold and indifferent, under the bridges. When I got home, George was at the table, working on a blueprint. He looked up and smiled, his magnifying glass in his hand. He asked how my day was. I said it was fine. A long staff meeting. I put the kettle on. I watched the back of his head, the precise way his pencil moved, and I knew I would never tell him. The silence began right then, in our kitchen, with the smell of cheap tea and the sound of his pen scratching on paper. It was a different kind of report, already being written. The first one was about Vasile Olariu. I sat at the kitchen table after the girls were asleep. George was working late again, a pattern that had started that spring. I think he knew to stay away. A single lamp poured the room into a small, tight circle of yellow light. The rest of the apartment was just shapes in the dark. I remember a child's shoe, one of Maria's, under the chair at the edge of the light. I had the lined paper Major Giugici had given me. The pen scratched. It was the only sound. Vasile had told a joke in the staff room about Khrushchev and a train. Everyone had laughed. I chose him because I thought the joke was already known, that it was harmless. I told myself I was giving them nothing they didn't already have. I was wrong, of course. I learned later that harmless did not exist in their vocabulary. A report was a hook. They could choose to use it or let it dangle. But once it was in the water, the fish was marked. For 2 years, I was careful. Also, I believed. I reported on a colleague who quoted Radio Free Europe statistics about wheat production. I reported on a student's father, a doctor, who complained at a parent-teacher evening about the medicines on Strada Republici. I told myself I was only writing what any observant person could have seen. I became very skilled at this particular lie. I polished it, I lived inside it, it had its own logic, its own quiet rhythm. The guilt was a low hum, like the refrigerator in the next room. You could learn to sleep through it. The ritual was monthly. The last Friday, just before noon, the secretary's office always smelled of typewriter ribbon and dust. She would be turned away, filing something. I would slide the envelope into the lower left drawer. My heart beat in my ears, a thick, rushing sound. I never saw Giugici again. But a younger man, with a thin moustache, would sometimes nod at me on Strada Horea, just a slight dip of the chin. That was my only acknowledgement. My promotion, my raise in status. I was a file number and a drawer. I understood I was not special. I was a piece of office equipment that functioned quietly. I managed the guilt by keeping accounts, a bookkeeper of my own morality. Georg had not been arrested. The girls were in school, their shoes were polished, they sang in the pioneer choir. We were approved for a better apartment. 3 rooms, on the 4th floor, with a window that looked over the courtyard. I would stand there in the evenings and watch the children play. I counted these things, I listed them in my mind. A secure husband, healthy children, a view of the sky. I was very careful never to look at the other column, the one with Vasile's name in it, or the doctor's. I knew if I ever added that column up, the sum would be impossible. So I didn't. I focused on the warmth of the radiator under the window, the sound of my daughters laughing in the next room. These were real. They were mine. The other things, they were shadows on paper. They belonged to the men in the files. It worked, this arrangement, for a while. The fear receded into the background. It became routine. And then, in 1960, they hired a new mathematics teacher. A Hungarian from Turda. He brought apples for the students. He wore a brown corduroy jacket. He had a laugh that started in his shoulders. His name was Alexandru. He arrived in the autumn of 1960, a new mathematics teacher. I remember the director introducing him in the staff room, a young man, 30, with hair that was already more grey than brown. He wore a brown corduroy jacket, the elbows polished smooth from wear. He would wear that same jacket every day for the next 3 years. I can still hear the soft shush shush sound it made when he walked. He brought apples for the students. From his mother's garden in Turda, he said, small, tart ones that made your mouth pucker. He would leave one on my desk sometimes, a little green punctuation mark on a stack of essays. His name was Alexandru. He was Hungarian. That was the first fact about him, the one that mattered to everyone else. To me, the facts were these. He argued about Cantor's set theory with the physics teacher as if it were a matter of life and death. He had a laugh that started low in his shoulders, a quiet rumble that shook him before it became a sound. He was my closest friend in the world outside my family, and I knew this. I felt it in my bones while I was betraying him. He ran a mathematics circle on Saturday mornings. For the gifted students, the ones whose eyes didn't glaze over at the mention of an infinite series. It was an act of generosity and also, I see now, an act of defiance. He used old textbooks, Hungarian ones from before the war. He said once, to a boy named Andre, that Bolyai's geometry had been stolen by the Romanian educational system and attributed to others. He said it as a matter of historical record, a correction. Andre repeated it to his father, who was in the party committee at the factory. That was how it began. In the spring of 1963, Giugici's replacement summoned me. A café on Piața Mihai Viteazul. I knew him only as Comrade Florescu. He had a way of stirring his coffee that was unnervingly slow. He told me Alexandru was a person of serious interest, that my reports on him specifically would be evaluated for their usefulness. He used that word, utilitate, usefulness. I understood. A useful report led to action. A useless one led to your own file being reviewed. I went home that night and I wrote the most detailed report of my life. I wrote about the Saturday Circle. I listed the students who attended. I described the textbooks. I quoted the remark about Bolyai. I wrote that he was well liked by the students, that this influence was significant. I knew everything. I wrote everything. The pen didn't shake. That's what I remember most. My hand was perfectly steady. He didn't come to school on a Tuesday in October, a Tuesday. I remember because I had a free period first thing and I went to the staff room hoping to ask him about a problem my daughter had with her algebra homework. His chair was empty. The director said he was ill, a flu, but his jacket wasn't on the hook, his briefcase wasn't under his desk. A week later, the director called a brief meeting. Comrade Fekete had been transferred, for family reasons. We were to collect his personal effects from his desk. There wasn't much. A spare pen, a photograph of his mother, a few chalk stubs. I took the photograph, meaning to return it to him. I never got the chance. He was in a Securitate facility on Strada Traian. He was there for 4 months, questioned, released. Exiled to a village school outside Dej, separated from his mother, from his city, from the life he had built. I received no acknowledgement from Florescu, no nod in the street, nothing. It was as if the report had written itself. Every September, when the new staff list was posted, I looked for his name. For 20 years, I looked. It was never there. I kept the photograph of his mother in a book on my shelf. A bookmark for a chapter I could not finish. I told myself I had saved Gheorghe. I told myself it was the price. But in the quiet hours, I knew the truth. They had not threatened Gheorghe that time. They had only asked me to be useful, and I had wanted to prove that I still was. That was the real corruption, not the fear anymore, but the proficiency. The way I could take a friendship, a man's life, and reduce it to a few efficient paragraphs on a sheet of lined paper. After Alexandru, the fear became something else, a habit, a career. The years that followed were not years of grand terror, but of small, quiet adjustments. You learn to live with the shape of your own hands, the things they know how to do. It felt for a while like the air had changed. The early years of Ceausescu. They called it a thaw. And in a way, it was. I remember the queue outside the cinema on Strada Universitini, a cold evening in 1966. A French film was playing. I stood there with my collar turned up, watching the faces. People were smiling, talking about the actors. But you could see it in their eyes, that flicker of calculation. Who else was in the queue? Who was watching? Who was watching? The relaxation was a new kind of test. I continued to write the reports. The immediate pressure on Gheorghe had eased. His file, they told me, was dormant. So why? I have asked myself that question more than any other. The answer is not dramatic. It is small, and it is shameful. Because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. The mechanism was in place. The envelope, the drawer, the Friday morning. To disrupt that ritual felt like shouting in a silent room. I no longer knew how to be the person who did not do this. The woman who walked past that secretary's office, her hands empty. She had become a stranger to me. And yet, in those same years, I was the teacher I had always wanted to be. I directed the school plays. I remember the gymnasium, the smell of dust and children's excitement, the paper flowers we glued together for the Snow Queen. I was there after hours, tutoring students for their exams. I organized reading groups for the gifted ones. The care was not a performance, it was real. I loved those children with a ferocity that frightened me sometimes. That is the part I cannot reconcile. The informer and the teacher were not two faces, they were one face. A single, terrible face. I cared for them, and I betrayed them. Both things are true. There was a girl, Ioana Bogdan. 17 years old, with serious eyes and hair she wore in a single, thick braid. Her father was a foreman at the tractor factory. They were Baptists. It was 1967. She brought a mimeographed pamphlet to school, a prayer, and shared it with two friends. The student told me, thinking I would. Guide her. Be gentle. Instead, I wrote a report. I noted her name, her father's position, the religious activity. It was a short report, almost clinical. I told myself it was minor, a formality. They called her before the party committee. They shouted at her about ideological contamination. They blocked her university application. She was assigned to a textile factory in the industrial quarter. I heard this from the school director, who shook his head and said, "A waste of a good mind." I said nothing. Years later, I saw her on the number 5 tram. She was standing by the door, her face turned to the window. She looked tired. Older than her years. She did not see me, or she did, and did not recognize the woman who had been her teacher. I had a sudden, wild urge to go to her, to speak. But what would I say? The words turned to ash in my mouth. I got off at the next stop 2 streets early and walked home in the rain. At home, there was Gheorghe. My quiet, precise Gheorghe. He grew quieter in those years. He had a habit of turning up the radio when we spoke of anything real, a complaint about the heat, a rumor from Bucharest. A shield of static. He refused, point blank, to apply for party membership, even when his collective's director pressured him. It was his one act of defiance, and it was a silent one. He never asked me about my work, not really, and I never told him. That was the core of it. He was the reason I had started. He was the reason I could not stop. He was the person I was most protecting from the knowledge of what his protection had cost. I built a wall around him with every report I filed, and he lived peacefully in the garden I had made for him. He never knew it was a prison. The thaw ended. You could feel it tightening again like a wire around the chest. The Western films disappeared from the cinemas. The colleague with the Orwell paperback was transferred suddenly. A new kind of silence settled in, colder than the one before. And the envelopes, they kept coming. I kept filling them. I told myself it was to keep the peace we had, the fragile normalcy. But I think I knew, even then, that I was just practicing for the hunger that was coming. The cold was the first thing you noticed in the morning. Not the winter cold, but the cold of the apartment. We kept a small electric heater under a blanket in the bedroom, and we would dress there, in that little tent of warmth, before facing the rest of the flat. The central heating in the block came on for 4 hours in the evening, a faint metallic sigh in the radiators, and then it was gone. You woke to your own breath, a small cloud above the bed. The cues began before dawn. Strada memorandumului. You learned to recognize the shape of a line in the dark. For bread, for cooking oil when there was any. For sugar, a ½ kilo per person per month. The meat ration was a theoretical concept. My daughters, grown women by then, would visit with small parcels, a chicken leg, a jar of preserves from the doctor husband's mother in the countryside. I took these packages with a smile that felt like a crack in my face. The shame was not in needing the food. The shame was in the quiet understanding that passed between us. They were now the parents, and I was the child who could not provide. At school, the hunger was in their eyes. The children, yes, but the teachers too, hollowed out. We had lesson plans that were more patriotic incantation than pedagogy. I had to find a way to connect Ion Kriangul to the latest speech from the president. You would look out at those faces, pale with poor nutrition, and you were supposed to speak about the glorious future. On Saturdays, they had to sweep the schoolyard for the voluntary brigades. I remember a colleague, Mariana. They sent down a new portrait of Elena Ceausescu to be hung above her husbands in every classroom. Mariana came into the staff bathroom weeping. She said, "It's not the order. It's that her face is there, watching me, all day." I put my arm around her. I brought her a glass of water. I wrote in my next report that she had displayed unstable emotional attitudes regarding the symbols of the state. The meetings changed. No more cafes. A flat on Strada Avram Iancu, 3rd floor, always the same smell of boiled coffee and dust. My handler was a woman now, efficient, no small talk. The reports became clinical. She wanted names of anyone with a shortwave radio. She wanted to know if the 56 uprising in Hungary was being discussed as a precedent. She wanted the names of teachers' children who had applied to emigrate. It was no longer about general reliability. It was a shopping list, and I filled the orders. I told myself the information was already known to them. I had become fluent in that particular lie. Then Georg's heart stuttered and stopped. 1984. They revived him in the ambulance. The hospital was a lesson in scarcity. The corridors were dark to save electricity. They had the basic medicines, but not the specific one his cardiologist quietly said he needed. The doctor was a tired man. He looked at my teacher's coat, at my hands, and he said, "It can be found through certain channels, if you have certain connections." I didn't even have to ask. At our next quarterly meeting, I must have looked shattered. My handler listened to my update, her pen poised, and then she said, without looking up, "Your husband requires Captopro. A 6-month supply will be delivered to your apartment tomorrow." She made a note in her file. She did not ask. She did not offer. She simply stated a fact of my life. And in that moment, the final veil tore. I had believed, for decades, that I was engaged in a transaction. My reports for Georg's safety, my compliance for our peace. But a transaction implies two parties with something to trade. I had nothing they had not already taken. The medication on my kitchen table the next day was not a payment. It was a receipt. The purchase had been completed in 1958 in the director's office, when I saw my name on that file tab. I had simply been too busy bargaining to notice I was already owned. The hunger of the 1980s wasn't just in the stomach. It was in the soul. And I had been feeding that hunger with other people's names for so long, I had forgotten what a full conscience felt like. The winter of '89 was coming. You could feel a different kind of chill in the air. And I knew, with a certainty that sat like a stone in my chest, that I would have to write one more report. I just didn't know who it would be about, or if I would be able to lift a pen. That autumn, the air in Cluj felt electric, like the moment before a storm when the birds go quiet. We heard things, whispers that came from Poland, from Hungary, carried on a wind that hadn't blown here in 40 years. The students arrived to class with a different kind of agitation in their eyes. Not the usual teenage restlessness, but a sharp, focused energy. One morning, a colleague came in, closed the staff room door, and laid a copy of a Western newspaper on the table. It was a week old, creased from being passed hand to hand across the city. We didn't read the articles aloud. We just looked at the photographs, crowds, flags that were not our flags. My last report was dated October 20th, 1989. 2 weeks before everything broke. It was about a young biology teacher, Radu Ionescu, a kind man, passionate. He had been organizing informal discussions with the older students about environmental destruction. He used Chernobyl as a frame. He wasn't shouting slogans. He was showing them photographs of deformed leaves, talking about half-lives, about what silence from the authorities really meant. I wrote the report. I described his meetings, the books he referenced, the questions he encouraged. I put it in the envelope. I held that envelope for 3 days. On the Friday morning, I left it in the drawer. I don't know why I filed it. I have asked myself that for 25 years. I think I filed it because I did not know how to be the person who didn't. I had been this person for 31 years. I knew the ritual, the paper, the pen, the walk to the secretary's office at 11:45. I didn't know what the other person's hands did on a Friday morning, so my hands did what they knew. Then it was December. The demonstrations on Piazza Unirii. We heard the chants from our apartment. On the night of the 21st, we heard the gunshots. Sharp, flat cracks in the winter dark. I went to the window. Down below, the street was lit by floodlights, and I could see shadows, people running, falling, helping others up. I pressed my face to the cold glass. Georg came up behind me. He didn't speak. He just put his hand on my shoulder, gently, and pulled me back, away from the glass. We sat in the dark after that, listening. On Christmas Day, we watched the television. They showed them, the Ceausescus, in that courtyard at Targovite. The image was grainy, black and white, flickering. I remember Georg sat very close to the screen, his glasses reflecting the grey light. I stood behind him, my arms crossed over my chest. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel grief. I felt a door closing in my chest. A heavy, final sound. And in that moment, I understood something with perfect clarity. The reports. My reports. They were now somewhere in a building. And the building was no longer controlled by the people who had given me the envelopes. After that, there were the rumors about the Securitate files, that they were burning them, that they were hiding them, that truckloads of paper had been driven into the forests at night. Then the stories changed, that the archive was being saved, organized. A colleague told me in a hushed voice in the corridor about the CNSS, that it would be opened, that people would be able to request their files. I went to work. I taught my classes. I ate my meals. I slept beside Georg, and I waited. I had spent 31 years being afraid of the Securitate. After December, I was afraid of the files. It is a different fear. The Securitate could be managed. You learn the rules, You learn the rituals, you learn what not to say. The files. They simply exist. They are a fact. A box on a shelf in a room you will never see. And you have no idea who holds the key. That winter, the cold felt the same. The queues for bread were just as long, but the silence had a different texture. It wasn't the silence of things unsaid. It was the silence of things waiting to be read. I would look at my colleagues and wonder, which of you has already been to the archive? Which of you already knows my handwriting? And I would look at Radu Ionescu, the biology teacher, and I would think, your name is in an envelope in a drawer that does not belong to anyone anymore, but it belongs to history now. And history is about to start reading. The lists began appearing in the papers in the late 90s. A column of names, small print, like the obituaries. I would read them at the kitchen table, my finger moving down the page, not looking for my name. I knew it wouldn't be there. I was looking for the others, the ones I knew. In 2001, I saw the name of our former school director, a man I had liked. A kind man, I thought. He had given me extra chalk once when the supply was short. His name was there, identified as an informer. I felt no surprise, no sympathy either, just a cold, clear recognition. As if I had walked past a shop window and seen my own reflection in a coat I didn't know I was wearing. The fear was not that my file existed, I knew it existed. The fear was of its contents, and of who had seen them. In 2003, I hired a lawyer, quietly. A man with an office on Strada Napoca. I told him I needed to make an inquiry through the proper channels about a file registered under the codename Liliana. I waited 6 months. The response came on a single sheet of paper. The file existed. It was substantial. It had been accessed by 3 individuals since the archive opened. I did not ask who the 3 individuals were. The lawyer seemed to expect the question. I shook my head. I could not bear to know, and I could not bear not to. I took the paper. I burned it in the kitchen sink. The ash was very fine, like grey snow. Georg died in 2007, a second heart attack, in the apartment. Early morning, before I had made the coffee, I found him in his chair by the radio. I sat with him for 20 minutes before I called the ambulance. I needed to tell him something. I could not decide whether to tell him while he was still warm. In the end, I did not tell him. I had protected him from this knowledge for 50 years. I protected him from it for 20 minutes more. I don't know if that was love or cowardice. I think it was both. The way it had always been both. My daughters. One lives here in Cluj still, one in Bucharest. Our silence has a specific texture. It is not empty. It is full of things we do not say. It is the loudest thing in the room. In 2009, my daughter here in Cluj mentioned a friend's father. He had been identified in the files. The family was devastated. She told this story over Sunday lunch. The soup, the bread, the conversation moved on to other things. I sat at the table and said nothing. My daughter was sitting close enough that I could have touched her hand. I did not touch her hand. The files are not about the past. They are about the present. They are a room in a building that still has the lights on. And 3 people have walked into that room and read about my life. They know what I did. They know the names I wrote down. I imagine them sometimes, turning the pages. A student, perhaps. A researcher. Or someone else, someone whose name I might know. I live in a city where I am known by people I do not know. That is the sentence. That was always the sentence. I learned he was alive in 2011. A former student, now a man in his 50s, came to visit me. We were drinking tea, and he was telling me about his work, and then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "Oh, and I heard old Securitate is still with us. The math teacher, in a home in Dej. He said it so casually, as if mentioning the weather. I remember the exact weight of the teacup in my hand at that moment. It felt suddenly heavier, as if it were made of stone. 83 years old, mostly deaf in one ear from an illness he'd caught in detention. I thanked my student. I saw him out. And then I sat with that information for 2 years. I took the bus in the spring of 2013. An hour and a half through the Samai Valley. The landscape was flat and open, the fields just beginning to think about being green. I watched it all pass, but I wasn't really seeing it. I was rehearsing sentences in my head and then discarding them. The care home was on the edge of Dej, a low, long building with a fence. Someone had once planted a garden, but the ambition had faded. The rose bushes were leggy, the paths weedy. The smell hit me in the lobby. Boiled cabbage, a sharp chemical cleaner, and beneath it, that faint, sweet, sour smell of sickness and age. It's a smell you never forget. I asked for Alexandru at the desk. The woman didn't even look up from her magazine. In the garden, she said. He was in a plastic chair, facing the thin sun. A small man in a grey cardigan. His hands were folded in his lap. Next to him, a rose bush with last year's dead bloom still clinging to it. He looked like he was sleeping. I stood at the gate for, I don't know how long. Long enough to notice the way the light caught the white in his hair. Long enough for my courage to almost leave me. Then he opened his eyes. He turned his head. He looked at me, not with surprise. With a kind of quiet recognition, as if he'd been expecting me, just not today. His face was older, of course, smaller. But it was him, the same man. The one who used to laugh with his whole shoulders. I walked over. I stood in front of him. And I said the only true thing I had. Alexandru, it was me. The reports, it was me. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of 50 years. Then he said, I know. I've known for 15 years. Sit down, Elena. He gestured to another plastic chair. I sat. He'd known, since the files were opened. He'd had my name for 15 years. He told me he'd requested his own file. He said he wanted to know the shape of the thing that had broken his life. And there I was, Informatoarea Liliana. He said it wasn't a shock. He said, in a way, it made sense. That hurt more than if he'd been furious. We talked for 2 hours. I will not tell you everything he said. Some of that belongs only to the garden, and to him, and to me. He was not forgiving. He did not use that word. He was not unforgiving either. He was factual. He told me about his life in Dej, the village school where he taught after they released him. The students, some of them bright, most of them not. The garden he kept behind his house. The wife he married here, a local woman who never asked about Cluj. The son they had, who now lives in Stuttgart. He spoke about it calmly, without self-pity. A life built, brick by brick, in the place I had sent him to. That is what I have been carrying since that day. Not his anger, which would have been a fire I could warm my hands at, but his calm accounting. He had built a life in the place I had sent him to. I don't know what to do with that. I have been trying to know what to do with it for 2 years. Do I take comfort in it, that he found some peace? Or does that make my crime smaller or worse? If he had been destroyed by it, my guilt would be pure, simple. But he wasn't destroyed, he was relocated. He was pruned back, like that rose bush, and he grew again in a different shape. My act was not an earthquake. It was a forced migration. And I am left with the terrible, quiet question of which is heavier to carry. You have asked me why I am speaking now, at 85, on camera, to strangers. It is not because I expect understanding. I do not. It is not, I think, primarily for myself. I am speaking because the files exist. My daughters will eventually find them, or someone will tell them. I would rather they hear it in my voice than read it in a document written by a bureaucracy that did not know me, that did not know what I was afraid of, or the weight of the cabbage smell in the stairwell, or the sound of my girl sleeping in the next room. I am not sure this is a gift to them, but it is the only honest thing I have left to give. So, my accounting, Alexandru Fekete. 4 months in detention. A life in exile from his city, from his classroom, from the sound of his own laughter. Vasile Olariu. Demoted, transferred to a village school where the roof leaked, never promoted again. Ioana Bogdan, blocked from university. 20 years in a textile factory, her hands among the looms instead of holding books. The doctor. I said I would name him. Doctor. Mircea Antonescu. I have been unable to find any trace of him since 1962. I do not know if he is alive or dead, or what happened in between. I count these names the way I once counted blessings before bed. There are others. Faces I cannot place clearly, details that have blurred. This failure of memory is its own indictment. I forgot them twice. I have thought often about what I will say to my daughters, what I hope they will understand, and what I know they may not. I do not ask them to forgive me. Forgiveness is not the appropriate category. This was not a sin against me. I ask them to understand that I was a person who was afraid, and fear, held long enough, becomes a kind of character. It shapes you the way water shapes stone, slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you look down and you cannot remember the shape you had before. You only know the shape the fear made. I want them to know I love them. I want them to know that is not an excuse. I want them to know both things at once, because both things are true. The love was real. The fear was real. They lived in the same house. I have a dream. Since my visit to Dej, I am back in my classroom. The portrait of Gheorghiu Dege is above the blackboard. 40 children in their seats. I am about to begin a lesson on Eminescu. I open the textbook and the pages are blank. Not a single word. I look up at the children, and Alexandru Fekete is sitting in the front row. He is 17 years old. He is waiting for me to teach him something. I always wake before I speak. I am 85 years old. I have been a school teacher for 40 years. I have been an informer for 11. I have been trying to understand which one I am for 26. I think perhaps I am both. I think perhaps that is the only honest answer I have. The woman who loved poetry and taught children how to pass a sentence. The woman who wrote names on lined paper and left them in a drawer. The same hands, the same voice, the same life.